Hi, this is Lenny Pfeffer, President of the Dorchester County Council, and you're tuned in to MACO's Conduit Street Podcast. Whether you're a Maryland resident, a government official, or just someone interested in learning more about public policy in Maryland, this podcast is for you.
Welcome back to the Conduit Street Podcast. I'm Dom Butchko, and joining me today are Sarah Sample and Karrington Anderson. Welcome to our special Sine Die episode. We are literally recording this mere hours after the end of the 2026 legislative session, and our 90-day-long legislative adventure has come to a close. I have mixed feelings about that. I'm a little sad, a little happy. How do you guys feel?
I'm happy. I need to be able to change gears now, especially because my interim is going to be a little different from everybody else's, I think. But we can dive into more of that later.
Yep. Happy to have it wrapped up. And yeah, I don't want to think about it for after this podcast for at least a month.
We'll probably dive into more of it at some point when Michael gets to do like a parliamentary process procedure, but there were some serious fireworks last night.
Yeah.
Yes. So to celebrate those serious fireworks and the end of our 2026 session, we are going to break down the ins and outs. This was definitely one for the record books. And so to kick off our conversation, we really have to talk about what happened before session in December. Usually the lead up to session is not, you don't see a lot of changes. And yet this year, the House of Delegates had a serious shakeup. We had a new speaker. So Sarah, why don't you kind of jump into that and describe for our listeners, what happened?
Just hit the major points. I guess I would say, so we had Speaker Jones resigned. It was right before we started session. This was a very big deal. And then and this is in the House of Delegates. So that was a big shakeup. And the domino effect that has is you have a lot of leadership in the House of Delegates that are jockeying around for position in terms of one, who's going to be the next speaker, but also who's going to support whatever individual that is, like which horse you're sort of going to pick in that race. And the interesting thing about that is that as all of that jockeying and getting in position is happening, it can lead to leadership changes, but not just for the speaker, but also in the committees. And so we definitely saw that. But I would say in terms of, for me personally, I knew it was going to be Jocelyn Pena-Melnick, delegate chair of HGO the whole time. That was my early pick. There were some other people in the running, but I was, not surprised to see that. But yeah, it did cause some changes in terms of committee leadership, namely, obviously, Delegate Bagnall becoming the chair of House and Government Operations. But then also there was a change, and that's one that I'm in a lot. But then there was also a change in Judiciary, where we had Delegate Sandy Bartlett take over as a chair of Judiciary. So yeah, just lots of changes came with that. There's a few other ones. I don't know if anyone wants to talk specifically about the committees that you're in and what changes mainly happened there. But yeah, the jockeying led to new leadership and led to a lot of sort of committee changes that sort of came with who was supporting who in that race, more or less.
And I think we were at our winter conference, either when this was happening or when it was being talked about. So everyone was kind of like whispering around. And yeah, you did kind of have, Sarah, an early pick for Jocelyn Pena-Melnick, for sure. But
I saw it no other way.
Yeah, you did. Yeah. And obviously she's a great fit for that. One of the other big committee changes is a new committee, which is the Government, Labor, and Elections Committee, which has been called many names, which I think kind of landed on glee to some people's delight and to some others' demise. Don't like that, but that's a big change. Chair Wells and Vice Chair Kerr are the leadership for that committee.
Which, by the way, two of my absolute favorite delegates. Yeah. Like, if you're going to pluck anyone for leadership, those two are very much near the top of my list.
Yeah, no, they've done a great job. And I think, for us, like, we have a lot of issues in that committee. Like elections, of course, we care about. That's Kevin's, like, that's in that committee. The government operations, a lot of the local government stuff in there. And then all the labor, HR stuff as counties as public employers, all that's in there. So Kevin and I are in that committee a lot. It's kind of interesting with the last change before session. So this is December with this new committee. It's new players, people that we might not have been working with as much, or people who may be unfamiliar with some of those topics. So it was a lot of like getting quick educated on who's in that committee and some new relationships. But I think it went pretty smoothly as well as it could have gone.
I will say for my portfolios, there were some seismic changes, like world-shaking changes this year. So historically, this was my fifth session with MACO, and land use has always been an environment and transportation, and energy has always been an economic matters. And so Chair Corman stayed on with the leadership change in environment and transportation, but to have the energy portfolio and the land use portfolio, two massive ones, absolutely shift. I don't know about you guys, but my entire session plans and I'm the crazy guy with like the chart and the strings of yarn attaching to people, and we have like 17 pages of how we're going to pass this bill or whatever. All of that got thrown out the window. We had a big energy bill we were trying to push. Not we'll talk about the leadership one, but separately MACO had a bill. All of a sudden, all the energy players changed. Housing was a central issue, and again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But a whole new committee, whole new leadership, even down to the subcommittee level. It was definitely kept me on my toes. So it was an interesting session though.
Yeah, I think for those two issues, housing and energy, with us all kind of knowing that those are going to be some of like the hottest issues of session, for those to just swap committees, that's a big change for everybody in town.
Yeah, and you can definitely see the committees, environment and transportation is a perfect example. Like they are like land use people. They've been land use people for years. Yeah. It's really in the weeds. For it to go to a new committee, and now you have all these delegates who aren't familiar with the subject matter expert. We're all kind of trying to learn through this, and just the vibes are different. So it was definitely a last minute curveball. I think we skirted it pretty successfully, but
yeah, I think like one of the biggest things I feel like that we sort of are anticipating in situations like that is that you can't make maybe as accurate predictions or assumptions about what might happen in certain committees when you have new leadership. And so I feel like for me, like definitely part of my strategy was to stay in even closer touch than I usually do with leadership of the committee, with the subcommittee chairs and with their staff, because like it was one of those things where it was just sort of harder to read the tea leaves because these are new leadership roles and they're sort of finding their footing, finding sort of like what kind of leader they want to be, what the kind of guidance they want to have for themselves, for their staff, for all the members of the committee. So yeah, I think that was something that sort of added a little bit of anxiety at the beginning of session because it was like anything.
Oh, more than a little bit.
yeah. All right. So, but I think it all went really well. I mean, as far as like the staff with the new leadership, I thought they all did a really good job, at least in the committees that I'm in, and even with the speaker's office, a lot of the same people, which I think lent itself to some consistency there where it may not have been before, is that they kept a lot of good people that I was happy to see. So yeah, speaker
something on that. Yeah, not just like an anxiety, but also there is like opportunity there too, because with people moving around, I think it did give us kind of an opportunity like very early on to be like, this is what's important to counties and local governments, and kind of frame some of those conversations in a way that we may not have had the chance to.
Yes, 100%. So to transition now to our next topic, I want to talk about who the winners were. So Sine Die, we gavelled out last night at midnight. There are some people walking out with big smiles, some people walking out with less big smiles. But Sarah, who in your estimation, who feels good today?
Okay, winners, I guess, in terms of things that sort of landed in and around my policy area. I mean, I would say there were some losses in our corrections portfolio in terms of bills we wanted and, things that we didn't want. But I would say corrections came out looking pretty good for us. I mean, there were 4, I would say, major wins, but I guess I'll highlight 2 of them. One of them is that there is currently a scholarship fund for EMS and police officers. And this year, Senator Carroza and Delegate Sample Hughes had a bill that essentially included correctional officers in those scholarship programs. So they now have accessibility to those programs. So the Senate version of that passed. So I think that was a great win, especially in terms of just, recruitment and retention of good individuals in the detention centers. and like seeing that they're being treated comparably to EMS and to police that sometimes are just more visible in the community because they're not sort of behind the walls, so to speak. So I was really happy to see that. I think that was a win for corrections, and I think another major win for that group is making the bill that passed that makes it so juveniles cannot be housed long term in adult detention centers. That is a really, really big thing in terms of, and I'll talk more about that later, but that's a really big thing in terms of operations in our facilities, liability, safety, and in terms of like the best long term outcomes for the juvenile. Yeah, that bill passed that basically says that they cannot be housed long term. And it does require DJS to step up a little bit more in terms of finding appropriate housing for those individuals. So those are definitely two wins I think that came out of the corrections portfolio, as far as stuff that I was keeping an eye on.
Carrington, what about you? What do you got?
Yeah, I mean, I think we just talked about Government Labor and Elections Committee. I think they overall can definitely be seen as a winner with new leadership, new subject areas for some of them. They were very organized and well structured. It kind of felt like they've been doing this for a while. You mentioned that there are two great delegates leading that. Yeah, I think they did a good job. Their staff did a really good job, kind of kept that train moving. Like their voting sessions, all of those things felt normal. They didn't lose bills. They were going to the floor. And I think all of that moved pretty smoothly. So I feel like they should feel really good about that, especially like right before session, that all changing. And then I think, yeah, one other that I would mention, I think just kind of labor broadly, really in both the private sector and the public sector, they had a really good session. I know there were a few bills that they got a win on us for that they've been having for 4-5 years. It's been a long time coming, I think, for them. And then even with the private sector, yeah, I think they had a good session and are probably feeling good.
No, 100%, especially on the Glee or Lego, if you want to be a little controversial. But the new committee in the House, just the way that business was conducted, it was a well-oiled machine. If there's any part of the General Assembly you're looking at where there might be some problems, it's the new committee with new staff in a room that's not really a committee room, but it is now. And they absolutely fabulous job. I do have to say, I think the biggest winner of 2026, hands down, is Governor Westmore and Secretary Jake Day, as well as Senator Augustine and Delegate Baylor. Housing had, this was the session of housing. There was a lot of hype going into it. And the General Assembly delivered. You had the Housing Certainty Act, the single biggest, most transformational housing bill the General Assembly has passed to date. It tinkers with regulatory certainty, early vesting versus late vesting. Historically, Maryland has been a late vesting state. Now, Maryland is an early vesting state. For our listeners, basically what that means is when an application comes in, to develop, your application is evaluated based on the standards at the time of application, not something that may change after you submit. There's also been some tinkering with the timing of impact fees, and so that's in there as well. Very administrative, very kind of, green eye shade type, as Michael would say, technical things, but really going to move the needle in terms of, how do we bring more housing to the state of Maryland? In addition, the TOD bill, and that was on a knife's edge, because I know, speaking of labor, Karrington, I know there was some labor stuff going back and forth, but the governor's TOD bill, which builds on the governor's housing bills from 2024, also passed. So I think if we're ranking who's walking out with a smile today, if I'm Westmore, if I'm Jake Day, ear to ear, this has been a great session for the two of them. Speaking of that, I want to talk about memorable bills. So I think the two I just brought up are definitely make the list. When we're 15, 20 years from now, rehashing what 2026 was like in the trenches. What is on your list there? For me, I got housing. Carrington, Sarah, what do you guys got?
Yeah, I think for starters, I would just say Mako as a whole, we are involved in a lot of bills. I think we're kind of known around town for testifying on a lot of bills too. We get in front of committees a lot. I think probably more than the average shop. But yeah, for us, obviously that's a key part of our advocacy. It's something that our members want. We track over 700 bills out of however 2,600, however many they're doing. I think maybe we were tracking a little bit less than last year, which we know that's a variable. But yeah, I think these are the bills that we're reading over the weekend. We're getting feedback on and discussing our team before getting them to our legislative committee. So like there are a lot of memorable bills because again, we're getting involved in so many of them. I think some of the ones maybe for my policy area that like I'll bring up an employment one of the HR ones, kind of when I was talking about labor earlier. So this was one of the firefighter bills. It was House Bill 532, Senate Bill 445, had to do with payroll information and collective bargaining. So this would basically for us eliminate one of our parts of local collective bargaining over the firefighter overtime schedule. There are policies there. So it would establish a statewide standard. Basically, anything over 42 hours would be considered overtime. The reason that matters for us is because a lot of our firefighters, it's pretty routine to have a 48-hour schedule. So that's like automatically every week getting 6 hours additional, if not more. So for us, like this, we know that the state's in a tough budget situation. So are local governments. So that does put us in a tough position, either having to pay additional overtime every single week, or the other option there is we could hire more firefighters, which we all also know that recruitment and retention is a challenge. So most of the jurisdictions there are likely to pay the overtime because they don't really have much of a choice. So the best outcome really there is we did get a 2-year delay, which will help that a little bit. But that was, one of the big bills there. And then one other that I'll mention that I think is one that will continue to get some attention. It didn't pass this year. It's Senate Bill 853. It has to do with economic development non-disclosure agreements. This was a really broad bill. It would basically prohibit like a bunch of different people, but including counties, from entering into non-disclosure agreements, or what we would just call an NDA. So from being involved in economic development activity, that included data centers, which is why I think that's a topic around town that's gotten a lot of attention. I think we'll continue to see that. But from the county perspective, our economic development directors, they're trying to get businesses into counties, and that might be an important tool that they use. And I think we just feel counties are best suited to make that decision rather than the state. This was one that I think it either could have made it past crossover. It was definitely one that we were keeping our eyes on, or be amended into another bill. But happy to see that one didn't move forward. I think we'll continue to maybe work on it in the future. We agree with the General Assembly on the transparency and accountability, but at the end of the day, we do feel we're best suited to do this. And it's, again, for economic development purposes. So yeah, we'll see what happens with that one next year, but it didn't move forward.
I was going to say, you had a very busy portfolio, especially with labor and some of that data center IT stuff. You earned your money this year. So I do want to go back really quick because you brought up a point on just what you said, 700 some bills.
Yeah.
I don't think there's an organization in Annapolis that is in every committee and tracks the volume that we do. I was talking actually with MDOT, and I think their number is around 500. So the fact that MACO's at 7, I mean, the reach of counties and the universe of things that we have to worry about. For those listening to the podcast, you might not know this, but for 90 days, we don't have lives. We do not actually have weekends as long as there's bill drops. So, I mean,
our counties know that because we're like, all right, give us feedback on this bill and this bill, like all over the weekend.
That's true. I like trained my folks early on in this job. On Saturday, I'm going to send you obnoxious emails, and please respond to me by Sunday because we need to make calls on these. Literally all hot, red hot, for the few that have received those red hot emails, if you know. Sarah, what about you? What are you, going to tell people when we sing songs of these hallowed legislative fights?
Yeah, I mean, well, just to your point, and I guess the one that Karrington was making earlier, just about how much we're trying to cover. I think the other thing that's important to point out is that, we're in a lot of different committees and we do show up to testify a lot. And there's a lot of advocates and other organizations that have policy team members and have, legislative directors or governmental affairs, and they do not go to the table nearly as much as we do. And that's one of those things that, one, delivering testimony it's hard. A lot of people can't do stuff like that. But the other thing that we sit for a lot because we show up so often is questions. And that is something I think to our testament is that you can really get pelted and you've got to know your stuff and you've got to have all your notes. And I know
I love it.
Always want our stuff in front of us. And so and it's funny because I had times where I had printed out fiscal notes and different drafts of
Yeah.
the bill and the reprints and the amendments, waiting for questions sometimes, and they didn't come. And now I'm like, damn it! Like,
Yeah, you're mad.
obviously you can plant questions and stuff like that too. But I think that's something that a lot of people will shy away from, which is a testament to our team, is that we do go, we testify, and we sit for questions, and that's a
Lean
credit
into
to
it.
us, and I think a major service to our membership.
So I just want to point something out that you just said
Yeah.
really quick. Because this is just like if you're just listening to this and getting into politics, a stupid thing that Sarah just said that you should definitely take note and listen to. Before you testify, read the fiscal note. It took me a stupid amount of time to learn that lesson. I'm not going to admit the amount of time it took to learn that. But if you are going up there and let's say you're not familiar and you're like, what do I do? Read the fiscal note before the hearing, even if it's published the day
If it's
before.
available.
If it's available.
True.
That's
Yeah.
why you really
Yeah.
gotta know your stuff and have great
Yeah.
members with great content, because like, yeah, sometimes you do have to go in there without that information being available. We have to sometimes go to our LC, our
Mhm.
legislative committee, without that being available.
Yeah.
So like being able to figure that stuff out on our own and amongst our membership, I think is also like a very valuable skill that we have, because you can't rely on those things to be there all the time, especially before
Yeah.
your hearing.
I'm like
Yeah.
refreshing the page the day of the committee
Yeah, like maybe
hearing
Yes.
we're just
for that
refreshing.
fiscal note. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I now, if you see me
everything.
with my iPad before my hearing, I have the bill, I have our testimony, I have the fiscal note. If I might have someone else's testimony. So I'm like, I am loaded. But anyway, Sarah, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Tell us about your
No,
bills.
it's okay. Well, so I sort of already started to touch on this one, but I think the most memorable one for us, or well, for in my portfolio this year, was probably that juvenile detention one. And so this is something, it took a long time for this bill to get passed. It has to do with getting juveniles into juvenile detention facilities and not adult facilities. But so for this one, it started off as its own bill. It was Senate Bill 296 with Senator Love, and House Bill 389 with Delegate Bartlett. And again, like I already shared, this is an operations and liability nightmare. And the data shows that it leads to worse outcomes for juveniles when they're housed with adults. But there's also this other layer that is required because of a federal law that says juveniles in our facilities have to be separated by sight and sound from adult incarcerated individuals in the facilities. And that, while sight can sometimes be achieved, sound is really almost impossible. And that puts us in a situation where we're not in compliance with federal law. And we can lose federal funding for things like that. And the other problem with that is that in some instances, we don't usually have that many juveniles in our facilities. So it can inadvertently lead to isolation for that individual. And that is not a first choice in any detention center, because it's just not good for, mental health. And we don't have any detention center directors that would disagree with that. But so that's been a major problem that we've been trying to combat. The other thing is that juveniles don't have service access when it comes to the kinds of programming that they need when they're in a detention center, and DJS has more of those kinds of services. Obviously, there's been some debate about what they do have available right now, but I would say making sure that juveniles go to the appropriate facilities is a really, really big step that has been a long time coming, and big credit to Senator Love and Delegate Bartlett for really championing that. But so as far as how it actually turned out, is that the Senate passed what is a juvenile charging bill, which was Senate Bill 323. And we don't usually weigh in on how someone is being charged, penalties, things like that. That's just not our lane. But what they did is that they included in that bill the provisions that were in Senate Bill 296 that would allow juveniles to not be housed long-term in our facilities. So that crossed over, and the House concurred. And so that provision ultimately passed in a bill that we weren't initially taking in a position on, but we were happy that it got added to a bill that was moving forward. And so those provisions did go ahead and will be taking effect. I think there's some timing on there. I'll probably do a public safety corrections roundup and go through the details of that in terms of how those standards get phased in. But yeah, I was really happy to see that one move in whatever fashion it was going to. So Senate Bill 323 ended up being the vehicle for that. And so I think it's a good outcome for juveniles and our facility directors.
I will say one big shout out there, because you mentioned Senator Love, really good friend to local government. We worked hard on a couple of bills this year with her, and so just gotta give props to one of my faves. Two bills.
Yeah, I would second that. Great process from her office and from her.
Oh, always first class. We may not always agree legislatively and on policy, but always a first class, like how she conducts legislation and process.
Well, and Yeah, and on that note too, just to give another shout out in terms of process, Senator Wallstreicher this year, when it came to the No Kings bill, there were a bunch of different versions of No Kings, and it was something where local governments initially were sort of captured by the provisions, and they really had a great process in terms of helping us work through some of the language with them, understanding what our concerns were, understanding, different things that would change certain outcomes and certain dominoes that are related to it. And so there was a lot of conversation process there, and it got to a place where I think we were ultimately happy with it. So, because it could have been a really,
Which,
really big deal for us from a liability
that's
perspective.
especially like important when an issue can be like so hot or controversial and a lot of emotion involved to have that process. So I know, yeah, we always appreciate that.
I'll say two. So we talked about the housing bills, but there's two more bills that I just want to put on folks' radar. So first, again, and folks have been hearing me say this for a while, housing was really, really big, but also energy was really, really big. And so House Bill 1532, that was the leadership energy package. And so most of the stuff in there didn't directly impact local governments, but there were two provisions we were, keeping a very close eye on. It was actually refreshing to have an energy bill because like last year we were deep in solar and we were deep in the energy fight. This year we were, more of like we weren't the main show in the circus. We were more of a side act off to the side. So that was a refreshing place to be. But there's some stuff in there about rooftop solar and permitting. We're going to put more information out, but counties should be aware of that. And then also the thing that's interesting to me, and I know we're going to talk about this a little bit in the practical takeaways, but there's a provision at the bottom of the bill that talks about a study to identify certain sites for where to site large energy facilities, but it talks about state level zoning. And so for me, preemption is a four-letter word. And so the fact that we are talking about state level zoning, it's going to be interesting. And again, we'll touch on this more in the next segment in like 3 minutes when we talk about, looking ahead. But to see that in a bill, that's interesting to see kind of where the General Assembly's at. On energy issues, we are mostly preempted. Sorry to use that word twice in a podcast. I know there's children listening.
Yeah,
Yeah. But it is interesting to see. The other thing I will say, Maryland passed a really historic bill. So House Bill 1221, Senate Bill 624, the Jillian and Lindsay Weiner Short-Term Rental Safety Act. We are the first in the nation, in the 50 United States, to pass legislation requiring short-term rentals have certain health and safety things set up. So smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, exit signs, really basic stuff that you would see in a hotel. There's not really state level legislation anywhere else for short-term rentals. We now have that. Local jurisdictions will enforce that. And again, we're going to do a whole deep dive on this. We're going to talk with a bunch of folks, so more information to come. But in terms of just making sure folks are safe, moving the needle forward, positive outcomes from our folks at the state level in Annapolis, this was really, really a historic bill. And it was one that I was proud of to work on. Big shout out to Delegate Foley and Senator Feldman there. As well as I have to give a shout out to their staff. Their staff really led the torch here, and just great folks all the way around. So with that, with our memorable bills, let's move on now to, practical takeaways looking ahead, kind of tease this a little bit, but 2026 is coming to an end. We're going into an election year, 2027. Going to be a wild year. So looking ahead, Karrington, let's start with you. Kind of what's on your radar? What's going on? What's keeping you up at night? What are you excited about?
Yeah, well, I would say definitely like a big topic this year and one that we know will be continue to be discussed with an election year. And then, of course, even after that next session, I think as well, it's going to be about affordability. That's why we're like having so many conversations about housing because people are, having a hard time paying for houses or the shortages of them. And then, of course, the electric bills, utility rates. I think that's something that everyone's talking about. And we know like that's going to be something that the General Assembly is going to have to continue to keep talking about. Even if they did pass a good bill this year, there's going to be a lot more there. And I think, of course, like something that we all talk about, I don't know how much the outside world talks about, but is the budget. That's
huge.
Like, I think, yeah. The conversations that our team has is that like this year they did handle some of that, but it's kind of been a Band-Aid approach. And we know that next year there's going to be a large deficit that they're gonna have to deal with.
Yeah, I think it was something around a 1.4, $1.5 billion gap that they covered. And we'll most likely do a podcast where we'll have Kevin on and he'll sort of, weed through everything there and sort of explain all of the tricks and maneuvers that were done to get where we are now. But yeah, so stay tuned for that for sure. But yeah, I think in terms of looking ahead, it was definitely anticipated that the General Assembly would not address the budget shortfalls that are projected to grow into the multiple billions next year. That are primarily falls in my portfolio. It's primarily driven by education spending at the state level. They are still kicking that can down the road again, despite knowing full well we're going to have to cut some of the education programs or raise taxes. And obviously, they view both of those options as pretty unsavory during an election year. So I don't think any major shocker there. But so next year, it can't be avoided any longer because that is when, for FY28, that's when the multiple billions in mandated education funding will start to hit the general fund, and the state can't sustain that. So, I mean, up until now, they've been able to skate by because they have been paying the state share of education funding from a special fund of casino revenues that are earmarked for education. But that money that Michael's always saying, in money in the sock, it runs out, and the shortfalls in education spending are starting to hit that general fund. So I think in the next 4 years or so, annually, the education shortfalls alone will be in the range of 2 to 4 billion with a B. So budget decisions next year will be heavily influenced by what is going to happen with the blueprint. Because yeah, that's the primary driver of some of those major gaps that just appear to be continuing to balloon. I think it was Chair Gazone. He had said explicitly it is a challenge and it is significant, but that they're committed to the vision. And that does seem to be a sentiment across the board when it comes to education. They've got to figure some of this out, but they want to retain as much of the vision, I think, as they can. And they're going to have to try to figure out how to do that. But I think that work is starting now, like yesterday.
Right.
That's going to define my interim, I think, is what's going to happen in terms of any major education changes that could affect how counties have to fund education. We're a funding partner with the state on that, and we'll probably do another podcast that is specifically about education this year,
Right.
what the interim's going to look like. But that's a big driver of what's going to happen next year, I think, with the budget. But I mean, there's other dominoes out there, like the Child Victims Act settlements. There's 12,000 cases against the state. I mean, not everyone's probably going to get the maximum, like the cap in that settlement, but even if each individual doesn't get the cap, it could still be in the multiple billions. So that is another thing out there that we will see what happens with that. Plus, like federal volatility, economic downturns, anything could happen. So we've got our own problems outside.
Don't forget about the other big thing in addition to Blueprint is highway user revenue. So I was here. I think it was my first session in 2022 when we got the highway user revenue extension. And I think it was for like 5 or so years to fiscal year 2027. So that'd be 5 years if it was in 22, and that's set to expire. And so we thought this would be the year that they're going to go in, fix highway user revenue, do a bunch of stuff with transportation. It turns out all of that's for naught. And it looks like the transportation funding situation is going to get addressed, with the future budget stuff, with the future blueprint stuff. And so maybe we're talking, an omnibus package or several massive packages all having to do with how do we finance our programs? What programs are we going to keep? How can we be innovative? I think the blueprint stuff is interesting because dollars don't necessarily mean results. And so how are we going to recalibrate around, well, we want to get these results and maybe it's not throwing more money at it. Maybe it's smarter policy. And how do we get there? I don't know. I'm very happy. That's not my portfolio, Sarah. So it sounds like you have job security.
It's going to be a busy interim. I'll say that.
Yeah. Yeah, all of these issues are like connected for counties too, because of course, like we've been talking about affordability and like this, with the state having to figure out like this big, like such a large deficit. Like we know, like we have been used kind of before, maybe for some of those cost shifts or cost sharing, and like of course we know like the only way is not like counties are a business that can just increase the price of a product or all these different things. Like we either have to cut core services or we would have to increase taxes, which none of that is popular. And again, it's an affordability issue, so not to be too pessimistic, but there's a lot for us to think about going forward.
I mean, the one big thing that I'm watching right now is, historically Maryland for the past several decades, there's been certain assumptions about state authority, local authority, regulations, how we do regulations, the purpose. I mean, listen, The General Assembly, Democratic supermajorities. Democrats like to do things. They like to say, we just created this great program. We just passed this great policy. And they want to go home to their voters because that's what they expect. I think the comptroller, though, kind of spelled that circumstance out beautifully with the Smith Island cake analogy where, all right, every year we're doing things and then boom, 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 boom. Now we have all these layers of regulations. Well, it looks like we can't do anything. And so one thing that I'm going to be looking for is what are we going to do with regulation and kind of what we balance moving forward? As that touches on housing, that touches on economic development, it touches on everything. Land use is a big part of it, but environmental policy. So land use historically, local communities shape the look, smell, and feel of the places where you live. The state, more and more looking like they want to take a bigger role in that. A lot of the environmental questions, we want a cleaner bay, we want healthier air, but we also want jobs and businesses. And how do we do a better job of making both of those outcomes come, again, without bankrupting everybody? So it's going to be, I think there's a lot of stuff that for decades now has kind of been, this is how it is, this is how we do business. And legislators in particular are really interested in re-examining those. And it's going to be a very interesting policy debate moving forward, for sure. So any closing thoughts, Sarah or Karrington, before we wrap up? 2026 is in the books. I think we are all thrilled.
I mean, I guess as far as like a takeaway, I think a lesson for me was how different an election year can be for General Assembly members. I think, I mean, this was my first election year. This is going to be this is my fourth session. So yes, so this is the first time I'm really seeing sort of the impact that can have. I don't want to say too much about that, but I would say that certain actions that certain individuals were taking in terms of their process with advocates, in terms of how they treated each other, like just their decorum amongst themselves, you could definitely see that it indicated that their focus at times was elsewhere, and their priorities were elsewhere. And I think it was really hard to watch and really disheartening at some times. And I think
it was a tense year. I think everybody felt there was a certain tension. I mean, my first year was an election year, so I didn't have anything to balance it against. But now going through several sessions and seeing this one, election years suck, especially when we're broke.
And so there was definitely, I think, there was some lacking in terms of process and I think treatment of each other and advocates because of that. And I'll save more of that for like our private thoughts at the bar.
No, yeah, I second all of that. I think, there's can just generally maybe be a little bit more frustration in an election year just because maybe there are things being considered that normally wouldn't be, but there's more of a pressure to get some of those things passed.
All right, well, let's leave it on a positive note. We're all going on vacation, so we earned it, and it'll be at different points, but we have that to look forward to. This is a great place to leave it. So Sarah and Karrington, really great episode. I have to say, this policy team, everything that we faced this year, we have a lot to be proud of. So congratulations to the two of you. Big shout out, she's not on the pod right now, but to Charlotte, who has been helping us with so much stuff. Really fantastic addition to the policy team. We were able to move mountains this year largely because of her, as well as our member services team. I can't leave them out either. They are really they keep us in check. But with that, great year. Let me read us out. So remember to like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Our annual summer conference is August 12th through the 15th in Ocean City, Maryland. And thank you everybody for listening to the Conduit Street Podcast. Do not worry. Kevin and Michael will be back next week. It has been a pleasure. Thanks, guys.